And a judge has ruled that Arizona lawmakers did not discriminate when they adopted laws requiring counties to verify the status of registered voters who have not provided proof of citizenship. These laws also mandate that officials cross-check voter registration information with government databases. However, the ruling did find that certain provisions violate civil rights and voter registration protections. The judge took issue with the part of the law that requires certain voters to provide their state or country of birth when using a state registration form.